Hi everyone and welcome to this AHDB webinar. I am Tegan Taylor, Knowledge Exchange Manager, Dairy Wales, and I am joined today by Dallas Lewis-Jones, Head of Dairy Development for Wales. If you give us a wave, Dallas. David Rose from Cranfield University. Give us a wave, David. And James Breen from Mapabag. Before we get underway today, I just want to go through a little bit of housekeeping. So all attendees are muted and that will stay for the whole presentation. Jamie, if we can just move on a slide just so I can, perfect, thank you. You can ask questions, they're all anonymous and you just need to follow the diagram below. So you've got an arrow in the orange box. If you click that and then click the white arrow to open the question box, type your question and we'll make sure that we get most of them answered today. Anyone who's watching again on YouTube, thank you very much, but obviously we won't be able to answer your questions because it won't be live, but you're more than welcome to get in touch with one of your knowledge exchange managers if you'd like to hear more. Today's webinar, we're going to run through the following agenda. So there's going to be a little bit of a background on the HerdAdvance project from Dallas. She's going to talk about some of the key areas that we have looked at across the project and how that came to be. We're going to then talk to David Rose, who's going to go over the farmer behaviour change work. We'll then hear from James Breen to talk about some of the data analysis and how that worked throughout the project. And then we'll go on to some panel questions. So if we do hold your question back a little bit, it will most likely be answered at the end, so please don't panic. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Dallas to talk about the HerdAdvance project and how that came around.
Lovely, thank you, Tegan. Welcome everyone. And for those of you who don't know me, I've been lucky enough to be involved with this project from development right through to delivery, and we're now coming to the end. It was developed as a strategic project. It was co-designed with industry and stakeholders, and to be honest, it has changed from what it was originally. So it was approved in July 2018, and on the ground delivery with farmers has taken place between January 2019 and it'll finish in March 2023 very soon. So it's been funded through the Rural Development Programme in Wales, and it's part of a wider or a bigger project that we were lucky enough to get funding and it was worth 6.5 million over 5 years. Thank you. The aim of the project was to help Welsh dairy farmers to lift herd profitability and performance. One of the key areas of this project and how it was developed was the need to look at data and utilise that data, on-farm data, to make informed management decisions. So this is a slightly different project to the ones I've been involved with before, because it's a pilot project and it's there to pilot different approaches and interventions which would drive behaviour change. And that behaviour, in addition to utilising data to make informed decisions, was to moving from animal health plans to animal health planning. As it's been a pilot, the monitoring, evaluation and the lessons learned has been a vital component of this project and has made it more interesting, therefore, to deliver. Because it's pilot, we were able to tweak it and amend as we learned and as we went along. So the project, the aim was to work with 500 farms, and we exceeded that number, and I'm sure it could have been even more if the funding allowed and we had enough time. So that's actually a third of the Welsh dairy farms, and they all worked with the project for, well, not all, majority worked for 3 years. Those who joined later didn't quite manage the 3 years. 47 best practices were involved. And as I mentioned before, data was a key area. So we collected on-farm technical data each year. I must emphasize the technical data. Farmers were much happier to share that technical data with us than if we'd asked for financial data. Animal health knowledge exchange managers worked then on a one-to-one basis with the farmers involved in the project, also with the vet. And one of the first steps was for the farmer to sit down with their own vet, an animal health knowledge exchange manager, to identify 3 priority areas and then set an action plan for each farm. The knowledge exchange managers then provide the support and encouragement to implement those plans. And that's been quite key, because obviously you could have an action plan which then sits in the drawers, as do many plans. So that I believe that made a big difference. Thank you.
Thanks, Dallas. We've got a question already, actually. And the first question was, how did you engage farmers from the start? How did farmers sign up to the project, or how did they get involved?
It was really interesting. We were actually quite surprised, to be honest with you, by the interest in the project, because this was a new project. And what we did was write out to all the dairy farms in Wales. At the time, there were about 1,600, and asked them and invited them to express an interest. And in that even first instance, and we didn't promote it in any way or form, we had 365 responses, which we were really surprised at, but obviously very pleased with as well. We've since had other expression of interest rounds as well. And that changed slightly as the project went, because we had the vets and farmers already on the project promoting the project at that point. Thank you, Jamie. Yeah. So as I said, monitoring evaluation is a key part of this project, and we split it into a number of different areas. A requirement of the funding was to have an overarching programme evaluation, and Miller Research are doing that, and it's a lot to do with project management, but outcomes as well. The more detailed information then comes from the cost-benefit analysis impact, and that's the analysis of all the data we've collected throughout the project, and I'll go on to that in a minute. And then David Rose, who is speaking later, he's been undertaking the Understanding Farmer behaviour change work within the project, and we also had a key area in terms of quality assurance. That's in terms of what the project's delivering, but also the vet's advice. So all these evaluations were ongoing and not just conducted at the end, which is often the case when it comes to projects of this nature. Thank you, Jamie. As I alluded to before, we collected data every year. We have a baseline set of data before the farmers started any work within the project, and then the technical data was collected every year since then. So up to 4 sets of data for some farms. So altogether, as it says there was 1,647 data collections, and they cover the major areas of dairy production. There's a lot of data involved, but they are technical and not financial. So those are some of the areas that we covered with those data collections. Already we're seeing some successes in terms of issues on farm, and these are overarching sort of project results, i.e. they're not per individual farm. We're seeing even greater improvements on some farms in that sense. So, and these are based on last year's data. We've currently got this year's data being analysed, and it will be available post-March. So you can see there's already reductions in mastitis incidences, lameness, and also interestingly, the age of first calving has improved by 15 days. And as I said, this is last year's data, so it's the 3rd data collection. It'll be interesting to see what this year's data shows. At the bottom where you've seen, it mentions improvement in recording and reporting data year on year. That has increased and improved dramatically as farmers became aware of how important that data was and how much information they could gather from it. Initially, there was a lot of best guess, but then they started to collect that data throughout the year in order to provide. And then at the end, each farmer gets a benchmarking element where they can compare year on year data on their own farm to see improvements, or in some cases not, as the data became more accurate. Thank you, Tegan.
Thanks, Stella. We've actually got another question for you. So just before we move on, you mentioned that the data was improving year on year. Did you have to put certain techniques in place for farmers to collect better data, or how did you encourage that process?
Yeah, there were a few different things. I think one of the most important ones was having a face-to-face conversation with a knowledge exchange manager who could explain what that data meant and the importance of it in terms of collating it as we went. There was also some sheets, posters that were made so they could put up in the dairy or whatever, so that information could be collected on a regular basis. Obviously there are sort of electronic and sort of online information as well, but the variety and the range in data accuracy was huge, much greater than we ever imagined, if I'm honest. But hopefully through working with the project that has improved on farm.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stella, and we'll come back to you at the end with the panel discussion as well. Just to remind everyone, if you are wanting to ask questions, please do pop them in the question box. It just pops out on your control panel at the side. Without holding you up for too much longer, I would like to introduce David Rose, who conducted the farmer behaviour analysis work for us, and I will allow David to introduce himself.
Thanks, Tegan. Good morning, everyone. So I'm David. I'm Professor of Sustainable Agricultural Systems at Cranfield, although I did a lot of this project when I was at Reading. I've recently moved over. So I run the Change in Agriculture group that explore change in agriculture. So farmers are being asked to change the way they farm, adopt new technologies, adopt new practices, and we help explore what change means and how to help farmers change, adopt new technologies, how the process of change could stress their mental health and how to support it, and also how to include farming stakeholders in the design of policies that are trying to facilitate change. So if I talk about what we did in this project over the last number of years, there's lots of different ways of trying to measure or evaluate farmer behaviour change, or to try and encourage behaviour change. Ultimately, you can have wonderful plans for what you want to achieve. If you can't encourage and help farmers implement it on the farm, then the grand plans result in nothing. So this was a really nice behavioural model that I think informed the design of the project in many ways. So this reset model that's been applied in various contexts says different types of behavioural interventions work in combination to help a farmer change practice. It's no good having individual interventions on their own. They must work in combination with others. So if we think about the context of the project and go around this diagram, various interventions work together. So farmers and vets and the people involved have very clear rules to follow, what was expected of them. Each year they had to agree on 3 priority actions, implement that over the course of the year, collect data. There were very clear rules to follow. Farmers received, and also vets received, training and educational support and knowledge advisory support from both vets and AHDB project officers and others. So they received greater knowledge as being part of this. Social norms, there were some regional farmer discussion groups where farmers discussed, amongst other things, involvement in this project. Farmers received economic incentives, so free vet advice, free AHDB support advice, free testing, various financial incentives for being part of this, and also received various tools to help them implement new practices. So these were things like mobility scoring charts for lameness, etc. So all of these worked in combination to try to encourage farmers to change. Now then, if we think about how we tried to evaluate which interventions worked and which hadn't worked, we tried to think, well, what would the methodology look like in order to be able to evaluate this properly or as best we can. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So these are the objectives. So we're interested in really learning what had worked and what hadn't worked to inform future delivery of farmer behaviour change in other projects. So we're interested in what affects farmer participation before and during the project, factors affecting the farmer's ability to implement the practices that they've been encouraged to implement, what the benefits of the project were for the farm, the farmer and the vet, and also some of the challenges that both farmers and vets faced. And in learning all of these lessons, it's hoped the future delivery of projects can be even better. So the methodology that we used to evaluate this, it was quite mixed, and I have to say in this short presentation, I can't possibly present all of the data that we've gathered. But if we go on to the next slide, I can describe briefly how we went about it. So just to say, this is not a typical behavioural experiment. There weren't control groups and different groups that received different types of interventions, which would allow you to look at which intervention led to a particular behaviour. All 500 farmers involved in the project received a variety of different interventions. So I can't say for certain it was this intervention or this intervention or this combination of interventions that led to a change. But what we can do is speak to farmers, vets, the AHDB knowledge exchange managers involved in the project, and talk to them about what they found helpful, what worked and what didn't work so well. So we had a third of the farmers involved in the project fill in a survey during the project that asked questions about what was working and what wasn't. We had some farmers, 54 projects, who had finished some at the 3 years, some months previously, fill in a survey asking what they'd done after finishing the project. I asked the AHDB, who did a wonderful job, to try as far as possible to contact farmers who had dropped out, either after registering interest and they didn't start the project, or they had started the project and dropped out, to try and contact them and ask why they had dropped out. We spoke to vets for their perspective in both interviews and surveys on what worked and what hadn't, and we spoke to the AHDB knowledge exchange managers. There's lots of qualitative data here that I don't have time to present because there'd be quotes and quotes on reams of slides and we'd be here all day. So I can only present rather a superficial headline analysis in these next slides. James Breen also did some in-depth interviews with farmers and vets involved in the project, and I'm not going to talk about them. But one of the main things we were interested in was, well, which kind of behavioural interventions that farmers received helped them implement what they were being asked to implement. And you can see here some of the results of those 169 farmers who filled in the survey. So the vet advice, the financial incentives, so free testing, for example, were clearly very helpful. The data collected so farmers could see whether actually the actions they'd implemented had worked or not and had any effect, that was clearly helpful. And some of the other interventions also helped. What's important to know here, though, is these aren't mutually exclusive. So, for example, you see the animal health knowledge exchange manager support, so that their advice in and of itself further down. Actually, the AHDB, the ACHEM's involvement in the project also helped farmers. They facilitated the data collection, so the data collection wouldn't have happened without the ACHEM support, and also vets and the coordination of the free testing, etc., wouldn't have happened without the ACHEM support. So these aren't mutually exclusive, but this gives some sense that the vet advice, the financial incentive, the data collection were really important in helping farmers implement those agreed actions. So if we move on to the next slide, this looks at continuation after HerdAdvance. So we asked farmers who were still in the project, are you going to carry on? And we asked 54 farmers who had finished the project at the time we did the survey whether they had carried on. And you can see here, both during and after, a fairly strong indication that many had carried on with some of the proactive health management and planning practices that they've been doing in HerdAdvance. We can move on. So we also asked, of course, well, what factors affect continuation? So there were 52 of those 54 farmers who said they carried on with some of the behaviours, all or some of the behaviours that they practiced during HerdAdvance. And we asked, well, what helped you carry on even though you weren't receiving any further financial incentives or free vet advice, etc. So you can see here, for all of the things we asked them about, actually many of these, all of them in some way, help a good number of farmers carry on with the same behaviours. So you can see the data collected in the project, which showed benefits of doing things differently, that helped them carry on. industry standards requiring certain practices like Jonas testing, for example, that better relationship with the vet, the more confidence that farmers had received throughout the project, more awareness of where to find support, and greater knowledge about the value of proactive planning. All of these things had helped farmers continue the same behaviours. We can move on, please. We also asked, and I don't have time to go into the different benefits, not least actually the data that Delith has provided gives some indication of the sorts of benefits that occurred as a result of the project. But farmers clearly said that most had noticed benefits. Those who said maybe, of course, those farmers who we asked during the project, it's understandable that some of them hadn't yet seen the effect of the actions that they had taken, because some of the diseases that were being looked into, Jonas, etc., the effect of the actions actually takes quite a long time to be noticeable in the data. But it was encouraging that many of the farmers said they'd noticed some benefits in animal husbandry, in profitability, in just their own confidence and knowledge of how to proactively manage animal health. Can move on. Now, challenges are just as important to understand as what worked well. And I haven't included slides in this presentation from the spreadsheet that we maintained about why farmers dropped out. So we asked farmers, I think there were 150 plus who registered an interest but didn't participate, and some farmers who did take part and dropped out for various reasons. Most of the dropping out was because of succession or business issues that were outside the control of the project. They left dairying, for example. Some farmers, very few farmers, actually dropped out because they said the data collection was quite burdensome or they didn't notice any benefits. But those farmers that did carry on with the project and answered the survey, we asked what some of the challenges were in implementing the actions that they'd agreed to implement. And you can see that for most who answered said they didn't face any barriers at all, which gives an indication that the support they received was satisfactory. Some of the challenges that some of the farmers said was a lack of knowledge or confidence of how to do it, a lack of perceived benefit, a pre-existing attitude against doing something they'd agreed to do. Very few talked about delays in receiving tests. Some farmers spoke about the challenges of COVID, which did challenge the ability to give face-to-face advice, etc., at some points during the project. On the next slide, we also asked those farmers who had finished the project, many of whom were actually trying to continue with the same sorts of practices as in HerdAdvance, but we asked, well, what makes it difficult for you to carry on doing this proactive animal health planning? And you can see here there's two that come out quite prominently as major challenges to farmers carrying on doing proactive management. Firstly, that the tests were no longer paid for. So some of these tests that Jonas, etc., no longer paid for, so farmers found it more difficult to do them. And also the vet time was no longer free. And there's some other things in there that you can see, lack of time, etc. But those two things, which refer to the financial incentives and the advice and financially free advice, came out quite prominently. Okay, next slide. So the last two slides I want to cover, and again, I said there's lots more in my final report that I can't present here. But an important theme that came out in my work, and I think James is going to talk about this a little bit in his presentation too, is the impact that the project had on the relationship between the vet and the farmer. And these quotes mainly come from vets, but farmers in their qualitative answers to the survey also spoke about the value of a changed relationship with the vet. So when we spoke to vets about, what impact did their time being paid for have? What impact did it have that they were able to sit down without the time pressure with the farmer, without the farmer looking at the clock wondering how much it cost? What impact did they have? And you can see here that the vets felt they were able to give better advice. They had more time to consider, they could look at data, they had the support of other people in the project, like the AHDB knowledge exchange managers and other specialists who helped them, and they were able to sit down and plan. And move away from fighting fires and towards a bit more proactive management. Tegan, do you have a question?
Yes, we do. So a question's come in on this point actually, David, around is the HerdAdvance model able to be replicated going forwards in a vet practice, you know, minus the financial incentives, but that sort of reset model that you're talking about, that wraparound support. What do you think?
Yeah, and James may well have a view on this later on too. And I was going to bring this up in later slides. So firstly, it's I've just mentioned it. It is can the vet practice afford that extra time? If you're going to sit down and spend a little bit longer, firstly, it's a question of whether that is manageable. Although the next slide is going to say that the vets thought that being able to do this improved their own practice. So actually, that being able to do this, even if not directly paid for, might have an improvement for that vet practice in itself. And also, I think it's a question, and James might have some views later, of also whether vets feel like they have the training and the knowledge and the confidence to actually provide advice in this way. So many vets may feel like, you know, they spend a lot of time fighting fires, and they have to do CPD, and maybe they have to work differently. They will have to learn new skills to be able to perform that well. So I think that's a consideration too, but I'm sure it's achievable.
Yeah, thank you, David. And actually, another question's come in, which I think is probably leading on to one of your next points. It's very interesting that the lack of time wasn't raised until the project support had finished. And does this suggest that the support in the project to help to reduce this barrier was, you know, all around that sort of lack of time?
Yeah, so a very few of the farmers, actually, some of the farmers who felt that they dropped out of the project and had given a reason for that, did say it was too burdensome and they didn't have time, but that was very few. So I think the fact it didn't come up, and it didn't really come up in the qualitative answers either, suggested that the lack of time is less of a concern if you're receiving all of this support. And not least because it probably takes you, if you don't have the support, it takes you longer to do stuff, or longer to learn things, and longer to find out where support is. So yeah, I think so.
Brilliant, thank you.
Okay, we can go on to the next slide. I've already covered this really. So as well as this, the farmer-vet relationship improving, vets felt that being involved in the project had improved the advice that they were able to give. You don't need to necessarily read all of those quotes, but that just really backs up the point I'm making. So if we go on to the final two slides, I just want to conclude. And again, I said there's much more in here than I can possibly talk about in this presentation. But if we look at some of the lessons about what worked, satisfaction of those who responded to the survey was clearly very high. You can see in the top right. Farmers and indeed vets and other stakeholders involved in this project were very happy with it. The interventions, like financial support, the vet advice, the data collection, but also the nuts and bolts that were there, the AHDB knowledge exchange managers, the AHDB project managers who were on this call, having them around to make sure that vets could deliver, the testing could deliver, the data could be collected, were important. And these things clearly work together. And many of the qualitative comments from farmers suggested that these things work together. Farmers noticed benefits, and continuation of those who answered the continuation survey seems to have happened in many cases. Now let's look at the challenges moving forwards though, because it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I've just said, well, some of these behavioural interventions seem to work very nicely, but everyone on this call is aware that and one of the questions referred to this, you know, money doesn't grow on trees, resources are not infinite, and moving forwards, many projects can't possibly pull together all of these behavioural interventions in combination to provide the free vet advice, to provide free testing, etc. I think there are some things that can mitigate against that. So quite clearly, those farmers who were continued partially said we'd continue because the data collection proved that us doing this had a benefit above and beyond the financial incentives that we received. So if you can help a farmer and indeed a vet to understand that what they've done has had a benefit and understand why it worked, then that's good. But also, I would be very wary, and again, I know that money doesn't grow on trees, But any future projects that can cherry pick certain interventions from this project and think that they will work alone, I think should be a little bit careful. So you could take a superficial conclusion from this project and say, well, the free vet advice really helped. Let's roll out a project where we just give free vet advice to farmers. But this project also showed that farmers were able to act on that vet advice because of the data that the AHDB collected, because of the other educational support they received, because of the free testing. Interventions on their own are much less likely to have the behavioural change that you want if they don't work in combination with other things. So I know it will always be a compromise about what you want to be able to deliver and what you can deliver, but I would just try and think moving forwards, how can we combine interventions in the best way possible so that everything works together. And that's what I want to say today. Thank you.
Thanks, David. That was really, really interesting. And I've got quite a few questions coming that I'm going to leave till the summary, because I think that there'll be lots of comments from Dalith and James as well. But there was quite a good question that's just come in, and it says, if you were to deliver the project again, would there be any different behavioural evaluation that you would have liked to be able to conduct?
Oh, that's a good question. So, and again, as I said, James, for example, did some in-depth interviews that I wasn't able to do. We had to tread a fine line between, we found a compromise between all the data we wanted to collect and all of the data that we could collect without burdening the farmer. So it would have been absolutely great if I could have sat down with every single farmer, every single vet involved, and keep asking them lots of questions all the way through. But that would have burdened, I think, many of the people involved rather too much. And I think moving forwards too, if you're doing things like this in the future, and again, I'm speaking from a research perspective here, where I think you can get away with having control groups and different sets of farmers who receive different interventions. That might help you get to the nuts and bolts of which combinations of interventions are most effective, but that kind of approach wasn't suitable here because we were trying to improve things for all 500. But I think some of the things we did was great. I think the fact it was such a long-term project was great, and the fact we tried to follow up with farmers who dropped out of the project. Many of the things we were able to do, I think, were a bit of an advance on previous behavioural evaluations that other projects have done, where they just come in at the end, they don't care about the farmers who dropped out and why, that kind of thing.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, David. And like I said, I've got a bunch of questions to come back to when we do the panel discussion. So I'll hold on to those for now. And I'll pass over to James, who did a lot of data analysis, quality assurance work actually for us on behalf of the project. So James, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Tegan. Good morning, good afternoon, as you know. We took past midday, everyone. Yeah, so my name is James Breen. I am a vet, boo-hiss. I'm still in practice in Somerset. I also have several hats in that I'm an associate professor at Nottingham University Vet School and teach herd health, which we're going to talk about shortly. And I also provide veterinary advice as part of the Map of Ag group to dairy herds, particularly on high welfare schemes, and as a consultant in general, particularly mastitis, because that's my research background, and I have other postgraduate qualifications as well. And then because I'm really silly and needed something else to do, I've started to take up rugby refereeing, and first gig on the right there, I got given under 18s in a cup match, and I'm 49 this year, so maybe they'll give me other 49-year-olds who just want to stand still and thump each other in the middle of the park. Right, okay, so for my little bit then, again, like David, there's an awful lot we could talk about. The first point I want to make is to just comment briefly on the action plans I reviewed and tell you what my main role in the project was in terms of some quality assurance, if you like, or quality control, commenting on the strengths and weaknesses of the action plans being produced by the vets taking part in this project. So the sort of advice that was given, the sort of advice that was, good advice, if you like, or some sort of things that are well understood. Some areas where perhaps advice could have been better, areas where we actually perhaps should have commented on and we didn't, and so on and so forth. The second thing I'm just going to comment on is perhaps leading on from that and the sort of thing David was alluding to, this changing attitudes to what we would term herd health. You know, so the prevention versus treatment, firefighting versus disease control, if you like. The third thing I just want to talk about is then when vets and advisors, are working with our farm clients, we do tend to perhaps give generic advice or some things that we've heard, and we sort of tend to say those things. Sometimes we remember to give targeted advice based on analysis of data. The word data has been chucked around a lot so far this morning. And again, I want to make a differentiation, if you like, between data collected about current management. In other words, we've asked farmers in Wales, how often do you bed up the cubicles where your lactating cows are housed? Right, that's management data compared to outcome measures of disease. For example, how many new mobility score 2 cows have I been detected with since the last time someone turned up on farm and mobility scored my cows? That's a completely different thing. The final comment I'd like to make is on the support. And the project provided a huge amount of support, both in terms of that, in inverted commas, nagging element of, have you done this yet? When's your next meeting? How did you get on with what the vet suggested? And that sort of thing. And also support with different skill sets required. We're going to learn how to mobility score. We're going to learn how to do this. We're going to collate the data. We're going to use something in Excel. All this sort of thing around how you implement some herd health and advisory work. And then maybe a few thoughts on looking ahead at the end. Okay, so in terms of what I received then, so I was asked to do some quality control work, and in the end, it was 45 herd submissions that were anonymized, encompassing the sort of the project length, if you like. So they weren't all herd action plans from the project in the first 6 months of the project happening. They were scattered about 3 years of the project being rolled out and implemented. And what turned up on my desk, on the left there, you can see the spreadsheets. This was the management data collected by the facilitator, in this case, the knowledge exchange manager from AHDB. So, sort of, are you milk recording? Do you vaccinate for this? What are you doing with calf feeding? Bits and pieces of management advice, predominantly about the farm. And the farm was anonymized, so I didn't know who they were. And then in the middle there, and just turned up now on screen, I got sight of the priorities and recommendations form. So what the vet and the KEM had agreed with the farmer, right, priority 1, we're going to do this. Priority 2, we're going to focus on calf health. Priority 3, we're going to focus on testing for Johne's disease, and some broad outlines. And then in more detail, that third thing that appeared, that's the actual action plan. So there would be clear actions, right, we're going to focus on Johne's disease. The first thing you've got to do is, the second thing you've got to do is, and so on and so on. So I saw that. And finally, I had sight of the actual red tractor health plan. And this isn't part of the project, but it does give me, as an independent specialist vet, a little bit of insight on, right, what's the vet and the farmer tended to talk about in the last 12 months or so, what ongoing recommendations are there, what outcome measures are we looking at, and so on and so on. So it gives me a little bit more background to the farm. Okay. Some insights to say, first of all. First thing, clearly the HerdAdvance project provided this very, very structured approach with support in terms of a facilitator and a lot of time made available. And I can't stress that fact. And David's alluded to it earlier. Actually, we're going to take the wellies off for a minute. We're going to sit around the table, with some information, and we're going to do a bit of planning. And by planning, and I'll come back to this, I don't mean endless reports on paper. The second thing, and the insights from the HerdAdvance action plans that I had sight of, and I remind everyone on the call again, this was 45 action plans that I had sight of. There is a real, if you like, predominance in terms of the focus being often on endemic infectious disease. So single agent infectious disease, particularly Johne's disease. But we do tend to equate herd health actions or action plans around prevention with infectious diseases, Johne's, BVD, IBR, and so on and so on. So there was a lot of that. And finally, the other insight was, in general, for me, looking at 45 action plans, basic advice was well understood. So vets on the front line, if you like, are tending to say the right things around, for example, colostrum management for calves. You know, if a farmer had flagged issues of calf health, or KEM and vet felt calf health was an issue, we're remembering to put some basic things in place. Colostrum management would be very important, clearly. Johne's disease example, separation of cows which are antibody positive for Johne's disease infection, you know, and making sure they don't calve with other cows, and so on and so on. So basic advice tended to be well understood. In other areas, what's quite interesting is the more complex endemic diseases. So the things that farmers would often, an interesting conversation with the KEM prior to the project happening, very commonly farmers would report, right, I tend to have issues with lame cows. I tend to have issues with cows that get mastitis. You know, for example, calf pneumonia was another one that came up a lot. These ones are much more complex, very multifactorial, and often hampered by an absolute lack of data. So in terms of the action plans, I saw some of the farms, you know, being flagged up with issues with cell count, for example, and these farms not engaging with milk recording. You know, actually makes it very difficult to do anything about the cell count problem, and or a lack of a structured approach. Some of the advice could be quite generic, if I'm being critical, that, you know, we would say things a bit off the bat, right? You need to take some samples for bacteriology. Yeah, we could do, but there's other things that perhaps actually are much more important for some farms, given the information the KEM's gone to the trouble to collect. And finally, the other thing that came out was we are excellent at giving farmers resources, and there's a lot of really good resource material available through AHDB, you know, but do we as vets and advisors use them, understand them, and so on? And there's a tendency, perhaps, if we're not careful, to bombard farmers with bits of stuff, you know, rather than hold them back and say, right, you know, actually what you need to take from this is 1, 2, 3, you know, rather than chuck it at them. So those are some interesting insights. Next, one of the other things that came out, the importance of data when we're actually capturing outcome measures, and just a broad sort of take home message that we still tend to work with paper quite a lot. And this is just an example for you with mobility scoring. So, you know, we're detecting very subtle signs of lameness in cows by using a mobility score. And as you can see on the left, beautifully neat and tidy, but it lives on paper, rather than do we actually, as vets and advisors and as facilitators, do we take this raw data and get it digitized, hold it so it's on the right, and then we line that up over time. And actually these sorts of projects are going to generate a huge amount of potentially useful data, but where's it going to live long term, and what do we do with it long term? Okay. My second point then, so there's a few comments on the action plans, and I could go on and on about those, I won't. Comment on changing attitudes to herd health work and the sort of the vet-farmer relationship, if you like, with this. There's always going to be a requirement for reacting, you know, client, I've got a sick cow, you know, diagnose, treat, and so on, fix the displaced abomasum event, you know, provide the cesarean operation, so on and so on. But a lot of the day-to-day challenges on our dairy farms will lend themselves very well to preventive approaches. Lame cows, cows with high cell counts, calves coughing, so on and so on. And the concept of what we would term herd health. Herd health is not the two I've, you know, crossed out. Solving a herd problem when we're asked, you know, the classic investigation, off we go with the clipboard sort of thing, that's not herd health. The annual herd health and performance review, you know, the static health plan, DELIF, you know, refer to things being left in drawers on desks. They have a place, don't get me wrong, but they are a static thing. That's not herd health either. You know, we would define herd health as systematic analysis of data. And by data, I mean outcome measures, calf mortality, daily live weight gain, cell count, mobility score, outcome measures, things you can measure. And you marry that up with regular objective observations of the cows, you know, hygiene scoring, stocking densities, feed space per cow, dry matter intakes, other things, and things around their environment, loafing space, humidity, temperature, whatever it is we're doing. And then you can make informed and timely decisions that mean you can adjust and improve over time. And that's for me what HerdAdvance is trying to instill and to give time to vets and farmers to think about doing. The other thing I'd say at this point, and speaking to vets, and as David alluded to, I had the chance to speak to some farmers and vets, is that herd health is still viewed as a little bit reactive. Well, we will do some herd health when the client says, my PD results were a bit disappointing. So actually the attitude around herd health is to do this sort of thing and this changing role of the vet, even through periods where apparently we haven't got a problem. And that's my challenge, and what the herd health approach nested within the HerdAdvance structure is. We get farmers down the road of reporting things. Can we as vets keep monitoring, even through periods where apparently the data is fine? We're still monitoring though. So my bulk cell count might be below 200, but I'm not going to stop monitoring some new infection rates just in case the new infection rate starts to rise. And here we spoke to vets, or farmers would often report, and here on the left is me doing, the routine fertility visit back in the day when I wasn't as grey. But just because we're there doing the routine fertility visit, does it actually mean we're also best placed to sit down in front of a laptop and provide a little bit of feedback on how the data's going at the moment? And perhaps sometimes there's a role for a different vet in the practice, who's maybe not so busy delivering a lot of the frontline services, for example, like PD. I think also a lot of this is viewed as paperwork, so it's interesting talking to farmers on the project, reviewing the action plans, talking to vets. Advisory work is often viewed as paperwork. It's often viewed as a burden, actually. But happily, some of the vets on the HerdAdvance project, really admitted that what the HerdAdvance project had done is pushed them and their practice into those places where perhaps they didn't talk about often. They were very used to talking about fertility management, for example, but did we hand on heart get a chance to talk about calf health very often? Or do we get a chance to talk about, sort of lameness and foot health management as often as we'd like? So that was an important part of what the HerdAdvance project, was able to deliver. Okay. My third point was on this generic advice versus targeted advice, based on analysis of data, on what came out of looking at some of the control plans that were submitted anonymously and some of the discussions with farmers and vets. So here's an example, and I've deliberately picked on the next few slides, I'm going to say something about calf health, something about mastitis, and something about foot health, because these three are very difficult areas and very multifactorial. So here's an example of one part of a control plan where one of the priorities was focused on young stock health and calf health, if you like. So I've highlighted a few things there, don't worry, but the key points were, number one, a focus on colostrum management, good, and use of certain bits of kit that we were able to give farmers, free of charge, obviously as part of the plan, which is excellent. Another thing, the second point would be, we often wanted to talk about testing of samples, and we can absolutely test samples, but this is where the sort of generic advice, we're sort of doing some generic things. We're going to test the colostrum, we're going to test some scour samples, and so on and so on. Now we need it to morph into more of, can we go further and start to say, right, we're talking to farmers about collecting weight data, for example. Are we now going to digitize that weight data and then be able to plot over time, as the graphic there, don't worry about the graphic particularly, but what the average daily live weight gain does in our calf population? Does it vary over time, and does it improve based on our interventions or not? And if we're not happy with daily live weight gain data, because we're asking farmers on the project, we're giving them weigh tapes, we're talking about the importance of weighing calves, do we then, next point, go back to the start and actually capture, right, what milk powder are you feeding, how much of it, and are we then marrying that up with our weight gain? And do we go back to basics, final point, and say, well, actually, I think we really ought to sit down and work out energy intakes in the calves. So there's some generic advice we can give, But then based on our outcome measuring, we need to target it perhaps more. And that's what herd health is, and what perhaps the HerdAdvance project has scratched the surface of getting us to start thinking about. Can we then target this advice based on data analysis? This is a mastitis example. Some good generic points about, right, we need to be making sure we're doing this in the parlour, we need to be making sure we're doing that in the parlour. Okay, but what if, next point, analysis of data, and this is something that we've produced with AHDB out of Nottingham University and the Remedy project, you could take farmers' milk recording and mastitis event data and very quickly show that the pattern of disease was nothing to do with contagious spread. So actually we needed to get out of the parlour and stop giving some generic advice, important as it is, but target the advice more on environment management and milking cows, for example, which is a whole different ballgame. And of course, research shows that targeted approaches work. This was the original mastitis control plan, back when AHDB were Dairy Co, and this was published work. David talked about case control, randomized clinical trials. This was a randomized clinical trial where we showed a targeted approach with a well-specified plan reduced significantly the amount of new disease you saw. So we do need to move, in some instances, away from generic advice, more towards targeted. And finally, a comment on the support and skills, because I know time is against us. I really wanted to make this point because there's no doubt that having the third-party facilitation, an element of nagging, an element of quality control, an element of pushing, was clearly beneficial when you spoke to farmers and vets, and you could see it in the action plans, the role that support gave. So what I wanted to just say on this area was that the HerdAdvance project is buying that time. Now we can talk about perhaps why that time isn't available in daily vet-farmer relationships. David alluded to it. We have a very busy week by running around fixing broken cows, TB testing, calving cows, and so on and so on. Do we as vets have the time? Actually, there is time available, but we just need to make it available and organise it, perhaps. And there's a huge variation in the approaches, but also the capability in delivering this sort of advisory work between vets and between vet practices. And the third-party support was clearly important in some instances. And I've got a clip there from one of my reports that I submitted, where the farmer was very keen to point out that the knowledge exchange manager really wanted to help, and that their view of the health planning previously was simply just something done to pass farm assurance. So moving on from that, you could see, and here's an example with foot health, where an independent, sort of third party is coming in to do the mobility scoring, for example, and the third party, the KM in this case, was often, for those herds that prioritise foot health, that was one of their key roles, was to come in and offer a mobility score as part of the project, and then back that up with several other mobility scores. But then there's also a role for a third party if the vet isn't able to do this, isn't confident with skill sets, handling data, whatever it is, collating data, the time to do it, basic abilities with spreadsheets to collate that data and make it available. And then coming back full circle, the third party facilitator is sitting down with the vet and the farmer and saying, right, we've got this data, I've helped bring it together, let's interpret it together, and let's come up with very targeted approaches. And here's an example of actually a mastitis control plan bullet point, which I think is fascinating. Generic advice would be group your high cell count cows at the end to make sure they don't spread infection. Well, actually, if your data analysis shows that you don't have any issues with contagious mastitis spread, and yet you need more room for environment management control, we'll get rid of a high cell count group and don't have one, because we need the space. So targeting advice based on what you're seeing with the data and having those facilitated conversations. Okay, so in summary for me, again, like David, a lot more we could talk about, happy to take questions, but the action plans I reviewed certainly allowed a lot of time for discussion between farm client and vet, an element of supervision from the third party, which I think is very important. Areas of herd health, perhaps pushing vets and farmers, which may have been previously ignored, and there was an element of there's some easy wins. We weren't testing for yonis, we can now test for yonis, but actually some more difficult conversations about calf health, respiratory disease, foot health, we're pushing people towards that. Action plans were a good start. Some key messages were made, but we can go further. Thank you, Tegan.
James, that was fantastic. We've had a question which I just want to direct straight to you in the first instance. So we talked about the changing role of the vet and the capability within the practice. Do you think that a vet clinic is the best, or a vet inside the clinic is the best person to be delivering herd health planning, or do you think that needs to be a separate person entirely?
I firmly believe it's a role for the vet. I teach it to final year undergraduates at Nottingham University. I firmly believe the vet should be doing this, and a lot of vets want to do it, but the answer is there's huge variation. So there'll be some vets that do not want to do this work because they massively enjoy the individual cow diagnosis treatment, and that that's their skill sets. You don't want me to operate on your cow now. I'm not a surgeon these days. There are vets who are very into data analysis, population-based work, but don't have the time to do it within their practice structure. You can fill your day TB testing, DAs, PDing, and you don't have time. I think it's fair to say there's vets that perhaps want to do it but don't have the skill sets, and it does require perhaps skill sets, particularly things like data handling. And you know what farmers, vets are like with laptops. And I get a laptop out in half the Nottingham finally and go to sleep. That's not perceived as traditional approaches, is it, to vet and farmer work? But increasingly there's more data, and increasingly we need to be better at looking at it and having a laptop with us. How often do we actually carry a laptop in the car and have 20 minutes, half an hour with a cup of coffee to review some key messages? I think there's also a confidence thing, if I'm honest, and certainly when I started off, I would not have had the confidence to look at something on the fly, and offer immediate advice. And that's where HerdAdvance brings that, well, let's schedule some time, in a couple of weeks, let's think about it, and then let's come to a meeting with a bit of facilitation and have a think about it together, rather than trying to rush it now. I've got a high cell count vet, what do I do? And we're forced into, oh, you could try this. Well, actually, we need time to analyse the data, and then let's come back and put in place a structured approach.
Thanks, James. That's interesting, actually, because the KEMs often went on farm, and the farm would say, oh, my vet and I have had a bit of a chat already, and we're looking forward to looking at the data. So it's interesting that you brought that point up. A really nice follow-up.
But forgive me for jumping in. There's one thing probably I would also say is the vet who provides the normal routine work, sometimes that might not be the best vet within the practice to deliver this sort of work. So, and certainly in bigger practice, you see more and more now, there might be a vet who's very into lameness and foot health, but they might not be the farmer's regular vet, but actually that vet is probably best placed to deliver foot health work, to the client base that vet practice serves. Sorry to cut across you, but perhaps that comes out as well.
No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you. And we have another follow-up question on that's just come in, which I think I definitely want to ask. Do you think that most farmers realise that a lot of advice is actually generic, or do you just think that they assume that it's always tailored or bespoke to their situation?
Some and some, I think. I think we generally are comfortable with what we already know, aren't we? If you go to a continuing professional development CPD event, you generally are happier when stuff's being told you that you probably already knew but just weren't doing it. But there's also an element of needing to move away from that. So sometimes I think it's obvious if it's a bit generic, and we would say things like, you do wear gloves in the parlour, don't you? Yes, I do. Now, if my issue, for example, in milk harvesting again, is something to do with new infections during the dry period, whether I wear gloves or not when I'm milking the cows clearly doesn't matter if 80% of my new infections happen during the dry period. Why are we asking about gloves? You know, so, but some generic advice still needs to be given, you know, so you are feeding 10% of the calf's body weight in colostrum within 6 hours, aren't you? I know I should be feeding 10% of the calf's body weight in colostrum, but I'm just not doing it. That needs to be reinforced. You know, but so I don't think farmers often always realise that it's generic. Some of them will, but I think a lot of the time the farmers haven't heard some things that are peculiar to their setup, and we need to get there.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. If I could just ask Dallas and David, please, to turn their cameras back on. I have 2 pages of questions and we've got a little bit under half an hour, so we'll get through as many as we can. Dallas, I would like to start with you actually. There's quite a few come in around just the structure of the project and how certain positions work. So I think the first one was, what was the KM role, and did you support the KMs with any training, or did they have any knowledge to give themselves?
Yeah, we trained all the KMs up at the start in terms of knowing enough about the different pathways or the interventions within the project to have that discussion with the farmer. Their role was not to give advice. That was the role of the vet, and that was made very clear. They can signpost, obviously, but it was not that advisory role. That's where the vet came in. So yes, we did quite a bit of training, and you know, we mentioned animal health, sort of the vet side, but also there was the genetic side, which was also part of this project.
Brilliant, thank you. And Dallas, if you were to design the project again, are there any major changes you would have made in terms of the structure? So the you know, the 3 meetings, the KMs, that sort of areas.
It's interesting. We went with the 2 vets meetings, one at the start and one in the 3rd year, on the assumption, with discussion with the industry, that vets were on farm a lot of the time. But you know, we've already heard from James, but that would have been very much in a different context perhaps. But as part of the project, it wasn't the intention for the farmer to work on the 3 priorities at the same time. It was to take one step at a time, because you know, as we always also know, that one issue might have an effect on the other 2. Would I change it? Yeah, there would be a lot of things we'd look at again. But there's probably reasons for and against perhaps changing things. You know, the budget was a key sort of area, but also the number of farms the KM could work with reasonably in having enough time to support. And so there were restrictions, but also we were very lucky that the project probably wasn't too restrictive. We've also had comments that perhaps there should be, the project should have been more open, should have been able to assist in more areas. But then it does become very difficult to manage, and as David alluded to, everybody knew what the rules were here in terms of what was possible and what was not. And in some cases, in some areas, you know, like fertility, there are so many reasons why that might not be as it should. It would, I believe, would become perhaps, it'd be more difficult to analyse what the benefits would have been probably, and just keeping to a focus made it easier to deliver and evaluate in terms of outcomes.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll ask you to start off with this question, Dallas, and then I'm hoping David and James will both have comments to make as well. So the question is, what would it take for farmers to be encouraged to share their financial data rather than just their technical? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it was really interesting, because when we were developing this, and even when we started to deliver it, when we had the expression of interest coming in, the first questions the farmer usually asked, what data do you want from us? And I think it's that they feel that their financial data is their own. They're not as willing to share that as the technical data. It's interesting because we have been involved in collating financial data in the past in Wales through the EU conditional aid, and we got a really good response from 2/3 of the Welsh dairy herd in that sense, but they had a financial incentive to do so. That line in the value of that incentive is sort of crucial. I suppose in this terms, the incentives came via a third party, whether it was the vet's free vet visits or disease testing. So it wasn't a direct payment to the farmer as such. It's just, I think, from a farmer's point of view, is that nervousness. Who's actually seeing this data? Where does it go? Does it show our business is, successful or not as such?
David, I can see you nodding along there.
Yeah, I was just going to agree. I mean, we and others have done lots of work looking at precision farming and the data that's collected and farmers' concerns over that data. And I think it usually comes down to the issue of trusting, knowing that it will be kept confidential and they can't be identified, who it will be shared with, how it will be used, and ultimately who's benefiting from the collection of the data. Is it the people collecting, or is it me that's collecting, and how do I benefit? I think ultimately it goes back to trust in the people and trust in how it's going to be used and making that very clear. I think that's the first starting point.
Thanks, David. And James, I wondered if you had a comment to make as well.
The financial data is difficult, isn't it? Because what do you want it for? So from a health and performance perspective, I'm with the Glastonbury farmers yesterday, and they would do their costings. So it might be quite interesting to look at dairy costings and look at margin per cow, or but that's a sort of feed efficiency, sort of nutrition and production type thing, isn't it? If you were having conversations, or if the HerdAdvance project covered ration formulation, nutrition, health, and production, so much more production now rather than health and welfare per se, you would clearly want to have the dairy costings information, and not all farmers would either do it, or if they did do it, they'd want to share it. I must admit, probably financial data is not high on my list of priorities, if I'm honest. I want the health data, and by that I mean a database that has calving dates, AI dates, PD dates, drying off dates, clinical mastitis event, you know what I mean, a stillbirth event for a calf, a mortality event for a calf. And of course, what we know is, whilst a lot of farms would run an electronic database on farm and or tell the milk recorder, a lot of farms don't. So you can't immediately go and get that. So you end up asking farmers, what is your calving interval? And of course it's a complete shot in the dark, isn't it? If you just grab their database, work it out in about 2 seconds flat. But so the financial thing for me, costings perhaps, if you were focusing on a production, ration, nutrition stream, if you like, within your offering.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you've highlighted the difference there, and as well as you mentioned the recording systems, and we definitely found that, didn't we, Dallas? And you've mentioned it already around the different kind of recording we encountered on farm. Dallas and David, you brought up quite a lot in both of your statements there around trust and the relationship building, and I just thought that it would be nice to get a comment from you both around that trust building exercise that the KEMs and the vet actually and the farmer all had to go through, because it needed to be a three-way partnership, if you know what I mean. We couldn't, the projects needed to build that relationship with all three parties, and so I thought you both might like to comment on that.
Yeah, I think we could see where that relationship was best. That's where the biggest gains were made. And that's much easier, as we know, face to face. So COVID did hit us quite hard in the middle of this project. Luckily, a lot of farms had already, and that relationship was starting to grow. But I think for those who started within that COVID, where we weren't going on farm, found it more difficult to get that engagement from the farmer as well, because it's easy to look someone in the eyes, isn't it? And rather than over the phone or even on Teams.
Yeah, so I'm going to use an analogy. You might think I've gone nuts here, but I think it hammers home the importance of the chem in all of this, actually. I was going to use a rugby analogy, but that might be a sore point in Wales. It's a sore point in England too. So if you think about why Argentina won the Football World
David,
Cup.
please, Carol.
So how Argentina won the Football World Cup, everyone goes to, they had Messi, the big ticket item, the star player. But Messi could only do things with the ball if he got the ball. And other people on that pitch, the Fernandes, the Otamendi, went round and did the dirty work to get them the ball. And there is a point to this. I'm so clear in the report. You could look at the graphs I showed and think in future projects, the big ticket item, the financial incentive, the free vet advice, the Messis, let's just buy that and do that in future projects. And you forget about the project officers and the knowledge exchange managers who go around with using the sort of softer skills to make sure that the vet and the testing can perform. This knowledge exchange manager, chased up the farmer, chased up the vet, chased up the testing. So moving forward, that project management role and somebody to build trust, to build rapport, to allow the bigger ticket items to work, don't forget that.
Interesting. Thank you, David. And James, I saw you nodding along quite a lot. So I wondered if you had a comment to make, especially from some of the in-depth analysis that you had completed for us.
Yeah, I suppose that continuing the trust thing, isn't it? Or who do farmers trust for herd health advice? Of course, they go to the vet, don't they? So the fact that sometimes you might need someone, and clearly we did need someone to make sure the vet did do, you know what I mean? Now, that's maybe not because the vet is consciously avoiding it, perhaps, but the vet hasn't got the time or has forgotten to do this or whatever. But David's absolutely right, and the oversight. The other thing I'd just like to say briefly is the sheer scope of this, mind. I mean, you're 500 herds in how many years with all these different streams available, whether it's Yoni's testing or whether it's calf health or whether it's foot health and Healthy Feet Project. I mean, it is a massive undertaking. It's very laudable that you went out to do this, but it's also not surprising that it then exposes just how difficult this is to do. And actually how difficult it is to do even with one thing. So you take the example of BVD Free England, for example, over the bridge, trying to do just that one thing at a national level is absolutely fraught with difficulties. We did the mastitis control plan with 52 herds, and that's 52 herds worth of stuff. I mean, and we got there, but you're doing it with 500, so there is a huge element here of the scope of the project. But you do need that facilitation. You absolutely do. Now, if the rapport is not there between the farmer and the vet in the initial stage, that's disappointing. And that may return me to my original point about, is the vet who goes there to do this, that, and the other the best placed person to actually sit down and go, you've got a little bit of a lameness issue, because that might not be very well received at all. It may be better coming from someone else, actually, who is able to build that rapport, because they've had successes with something differently, in the past.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. Coming back to you, James, first of all, and then for David and Dallas to comment on, do you think that over availability of resources can cloud people's judgment, farmers and all vets, and it can sometimes lead to a focus on the wrong thing for their farm? It comes back to that generic information thing.
Yeah, definitely. So definitely we can bombard people with resources. That's not to say the resources are not very good, because they are. And I've been involved in some of them, so I know the sorts of things that AHDB have produced. But we do have a tendency to spam stuff to people, and if we're not careful, that can overwhelm them. I'll give you the example, and I don't want to keep going back to mastitis control, but for example, with mastitis control, we're sort of, right, here's your resources on contagious mastitis, here's your resource material on drying off, here's your resource material on cubicle management in lactating cows. And you're like, right, hang on, which one for that particular farm, given that particular pattern of infection, is the one they need now. Never mind about the others. So there's that. I think but I think the resource material is really important because the facilitators and the vets need it to make sure that if well, we've always said do this, you're like, well, actually, I wouldn't. And if you turn to the resource material that Sarah Pedersen's produced around foot health, or Ginny Sherwin's done on calf stuff, or Nick Bell's done, you know what I mean? There's actually very clear research-led advice that suggests that you really shouldn't be saying what you're saying. We need to be moving towards that now. For example, foot trimming dairy cows. Everybody used to say 75 mil, width of your hand, or that sort of thing. Actually, no. Research evidence has moved on, and it's not that now. And the resource material will have that for us to refer to.
Thanks, James. David, I can see you nodding along.
I don't think I have anything more to add. I think that encompassed broadly what I might have said.
Okay, brilliant. Della?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we were trying to be careful while we were developing this project that we wouldn't overwhelm the farmers by insisting that they actually, addressed all three priorities at the same time. It was very much up to them how they wanted to do it step by step, or, I'll do this now and I'll do that. So I think that is critical, because if they feel overwhelmed, they just say, whoa, I'm not doing this at all then, kind of thing. So we're very conscious of that.
Yeah, no, definitely. David, how much thought was given to farmer behaviour in terms of how the farmers were managed throughout the project, and were you able to make any changes throughout the project? And Dallas, you might like to comment on this as well.
Is that a question of how the farmer behaviour was evaluated, or how the farmer behaviour was managed? Because that sounds like a project delivery question.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. So if you start with the evaluation side, and then Dallas can come in with the project side, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, so for me, I think the plan adapted all the way through, because I think you have grand plans at the start about how many times you want to talk to everybody and all the data you want to collect, but you have to be pragmatic about what you can collect. And we always had to be careful that we didn't keep overburdening the farmer all the time. So we had to have thoughts about, well, how often do we remind them to do the survey? And if we can't go and overburden the farmer with something else, well, can we ask some similar questions of vets or the chems who work with the farmers? So it was trying to collect as much data as possible about what was influencing practice without overburdening any one source, I think. So we always had the questions about, is this too much? Is this too little? And maybe we not found a perfect balance, but it was all a compromise between what we wanted and what we could get and what was fair.
Brilliant, thank you. And Della?
In terms of delivery, we depended very much on the Animal Health Knowledge Exchange managed to manage that farmer relationship. So they would have managed that behaviour change, hopefully a positive one, in terms of encourage them to take action and to keep going. So it was very much down to that individual, and we've been very lucky in having a high quality field staff team, to be honest, which has been, as already has been mentioned, has been quite critical in making this whole project work.
Brilliant, thank you. And the last question I want to come to today, Dallas, is for you. And the others, James and David, you might like to comment as well. But so Dallas, how did the project initially decide on animal health planning as the focus? And do you believe this same approach is transferable to other areas on farm?
Yeah, well, way before this project started to be developed, we held focus groups with the industry, and animal health being one of the key areas. Grassland, as you would imagine, was another one in Wales. But I suppose we wanted to do something that hadn't been done before. And as we were going through that development stage, it became clear that, this, as I said, the data element was the priority at the start, but that might have changed, although it's still key there. But the rationale perhaps for where we got to initially was quite different. animal health being such a big influence on, you know, not just the farm's profitability, but also on the carbon side as well. And even at the start, we realised that even though things like mastinitis and lameness had been, you know, been discussed and were been worked on for numerous years, there was still some issues there. So working on the animal health and welfare framework groups priorities in Wales, that was how we decided on those priority areas. We also, because it was animal health, we brought the genetics part into it as well, which will become even more you know, important as we sort of develop towards a net zero in particular.
Brilliant. And do you feel that this same structured approach could be transferred into other areas?
Oh, it'd be interesting, because obviously the advisors in this context were vets. Whether you have that support in enough numbers in other areas, whether it would be soils or whatever, would be questionable. And also when it comes to animal health and welfare, I think every farm is different, and therefore, yeah, it could be transferable. It wouldn't be quite the same, but I suppose, you know, in terms of the structure, it could be transferable, but probably wouldn't have the same outcome or impact.
Thank you, Dallas. And David, I could see you nodding along there. Did you have any final comments you would like to make?
Yeah, I mean, this is a simplification, but broadly speaking, I think some of the high-level messages of the project about what helps farmers do something different are broadly transferable. So whether we're asking a farmer to change animal health planning behaviour, adopt a new technology, change to a regenerative system, whatever it is we want them to do different, it's usually a combination of well, what's the cost and the benefit of doing it? Do they have the knowledge and the skills, and is it easy to do? Do they have advisory support? Are they encouraged to share lessons with their peers? Do policies and legislations enable them to do it? And ultimately, it's always about looking at the range of stakeholders that affect what happens on a farm: farmer, vet, agronomist, buyer, retail, you know, all of those people, and to include them in making it as easy as possible for a farmer to do something different. I think the messages from this project show if you can bring different stakeholders together and support farmers in different ways, then that gives you the best possible chance of change.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. And James, I just wondered if you had any final comments to make.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's very transferable, the approach, isn't it? You know, you're signing up large numbers of herds and you're offering time, or you're offering expertise, or whatever you do. I think you'd probably go the other way. So you could certainly go into areas that weren't animal health and welfare, couldn't you? You could go feed efficiency, you could go something around production, you could go grassland, like you say, you could go into other areas, sustainability, regen, environment, or you could come back to animal health and welfare, and you could actually narrow it. You know, Dallas alluded to earlier, you know, well, the farmers could, you know, go at their own pace and not overwhelm them. But actually, if you have 3 priorities, one of them says foot health, one of them says calf health, and one of them says, you know, housing and mastitis. I mean, they're huge topic areas, aren't they? So you could also go the other way and say, right, you know, if we do something in future, we're going to say improving foot health in Welsh dairy herds, and just go one thing, you know, which is complicated enough just by itself, and you go like that. But it's absolutely transferable, that combination of management data collection, facilitation, time, and then outcome measure data collection, which you've started to scratch the surface with, you know, but needs help with, probably electronic data collection, you know, and actually whether is the person to do that bit or they need help, and whether the facilitator takes more of a role. But it's absolutely transferable, absolutely is.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. So thank you everyone for joining. That's all of the questions that we've got time for today. As I said, this webinar will be available on YouTube, most likely by the end of the week. And anyone that signed up today will get a direct link to the recording as well, so you are able to watch it. And I've had some comments already in the chat box saying, you know, how can this be available later on? So that's how it will be available on the AHDB Dairy YouTube. I just want to bring it back to the title today around changing farmer behaviour. We heard from Dallas with the project aims of using data to proactively make on-farm decisions, and we heard about the importance of the full wraparound support from David. And finally from James, who we've heard around the structured approach to interventions were just as important to the success of this project. If you'd like to find out more about what HerdAdvance has been able to achieve or any other information, please follow the links that are on your screen, AHDB/HerdAdvance, or any of the project case studies. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you all again soon. Bye.